One, they wanted to make the safety data easier to understand. Two, they wanted to sharpen the focus on higher risk carriers. Three, they wanted to streamline analysis and reporting. Four, really wanted to refine and strengthen safety percentiles. And five, wanted to acknowledge and reinforce safe practices. And some of this picks up, Sean, to your point, on some of the deficiencies that have been pointed out over the years. So,
trucking is difficult. It's an essential industry that every corner of the nation depends on, even without knowing it. To the average consumer, the supply chain is magic, and sometimes a black hole. Products on store shelves, dinner on restaurant tables, packages on doorsteps. It's expected to be there on time, every time, and only recognized if there's a service failure. But how is the sausage made? Who's talking about the issues that matter to trucking companies?
welcome to TrueNorth Truck Thought, or the Triple T Pod for short, a monthly podcast hosted by Scopelitis Transportation Consulting and brought to you by TrueNorth Companies. We're here to demystify the magic, address the black holes, and to talk trucking to the industry we love. Whether it's the latest research, upcoming laws and rules, safety issues and solutions, or practical discussions about real-life supply chain challenges, the Triple T Pod is here to help the most important industry in our country to navigate its greatest challenges and opportunities. We bring together some of the best and brightest experts to talk about and tackle some of the most pressing industry issues. So without further ado, I'm Steve Keppler.
And I'm Sean Garney. Let's get trucking.
All right. Well, welcome back to the Triple T Pod, Steve. As always, month number 3 in 2023. Excited to be here. Hope you're doing well today.
Yeah, so far so good, but and the week's almost over, so we'll have to wait and see. But everything comes at the end of the week, right? Friday's always a challenge, right? So we'll see what tomorrow holds.
That's it. Well, today is a special day because we get one of our favorite guests back here on the Triple T Pod. That, of course, is Bert. Bert is Vice President of Risk Solutions. Mr. Mayo, welcome back to the pod. Happy to have you and your expertise here today.
Thank you. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Glad to be here. Hope y'all's day is going well.
So far, so good, except we're about to dive into one of my most loved and hated topics, compliance, safety, and accountability. Some big news came just a few weeks ago on Valentine's Day. FMCSA declared its undying love for the Compliance, Safety, and Accountability Program, as we know, by rejecting a suit it had sort of been flirting with for nearly 6 years, and that is, of course, the item response theory. The industry, I think, exhaled sort of a collective sigh of relief as it had been very anxious about having to adapt to the new CSA methodology, which they didn't really find very easily understandable or explainable. But now, of course, as FMCSA enters its new phase of this long-term relationship with CSA, it's as we do of our partners sometimes, asking it to change, and hopefully for the better. So I think today we're going to talk a little bit about what FMCSA is proposing with their proposed changes to compliance, safety, and accountability. Why they're proposing them and what the impacts might be. But before we do that, why don't we take a walk down memory lane? What do you think, guys?
Sounds good. It's always good to reflect on the past, right?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll give us just a general overview. And Steve and Bert, please, if I miss anything, hop in there. Let everybody know what I might have missed. But we'll talk about sort of where CSA comes from for just a little bit. And then maybe, Steve, I'll ask you to jump into what FMCSA is proposing as far as changes goes. So if we jump in the Wayback Machine, I think we can go back to about 2008 when FMCSA started testing a system they were calling Comprehensive Safety Analysis 2010 in about 9 states. 2 years later, they launched that Comprehensive Safety Analysis, which we know now as Compliance, Safety, and Accountability. In sort of a predictable way, the industry didn't like CSA very much early on, right? It was still understanding how it worked, but most concerning was that it was public, and it was difficult to explain the scores to stakeholders, and they felt that it might be an inaccurate depiction of safety, right? We were still unpacking the box of CSA and figuring out how to use it. And for the next several years, there were lots of studies, some government studies, some private studies, And several critical themes emerged out of those studies, right? Some of these familiar complaints that we know of for CSA, those were things like there was no control for geographic enforcement disparities. So maybe was it measuring where I operated, not how I operated? If I'm driving in Indiana, then more than any other state, and I'm collecting speeding tickets like pieces of gum, then maybe my unsafe driving score is elevated over other people's unsafe driving score that don't operate in Indiana quite as much, those sorts of things. There was, of course, no indication of crash preventability. We know in the industry that the vast majority of crashes were certainly not the fault of the truck driver, and many of them couldn't have been prevented, and CSA failed to account for that. Some exposure data was self-reported, right? And so if we measure exposure by vehicle miles traveled and power units, how do we validate that data? That was a concern. Data sufficiency thresholds were too low, resulting in inaccurate prioritization and unnecessary prioritization for intervention. Severity weights are based on expert and subjective opinion was another complaint that we heard often. How did you get to the severity weights that you applied? Which violations should matter more as far as measuring my safety risk? The somewhat arbitrary cutoffs of safety event groups. So this idea of measuring carriers with carriers of similar size is generally a good idea, but what happens when you're on the cusp of two different safety event groups and how that might make your score sort of swing wildly? And generally the relative nature of the system doesn't really allow for the absolute, an absolute objective look at safety. Those are just some of the concerns that were raised over the years. And from 2010, to FMCSA's credit, they really continued to tinker with the system over the years, right? They made a bunch of changes. We'll recall when the vehicle maintenance basic was called the cargo securement basic, or the cargo related basic rather. And they separated those cargo securement violations, put those in the vehicle maintenance basic. They renamed the cargo related basic the hazardous material basic. They renamed the fatigue driver basic the hours of service basic. They did some adjustment of violation groupings and severity weights. Of course, remember they instituted the adjudicated citation rule, which was very helpful for carriers getting violations removed from CSA. And of course, the crash preventability program. But you know what? Over the years, I think Congress eventually got sick of hearing the bickering between the industry and the regulators, and they finally asked the National Academies of Sciences to study the issue, right? And that was 2015 with the FAST Act. And they said, hey, FMCSA, it's time for you to pull those public scores down and ask, and then at the same time, ask the National Academies of Science to look at the issue, to see if there's a better way to rate carriers as far as their score goes and prioritize them for intervention, right? Of course, the National Academies of Science made a bunch of recommendations, not all of which we're going to go over here. But the big one that they made that really started making people nervous was this changing to the item response theory methodology. And the item response theory methodology is used in healthcare and in education. And it's really sort of a self-calibrating model that on its face had a lot of benefits, but under the surface was difficult to understand, required a certain amount of expertise to use. And so since then, and that was 2017, if I remember correctly, the industry has been waiting a little bit on sort of bated breath, wondering if FMCSA is going to pull the rug out from under the industry. It's been 12 years since we've been adapting to the CSA model. It's been 12 years that we've been working on understanding how violations impact our score and whether or not that score is going to invite federal or state enforcement officials into my business to investigate my compliance and safety. And so the prospect of changing to item response theory was something that was, I think, really concerning to everybody. And part of this notice, of course, was FMCSA saying, hey, we're not going to go with item response theory, right? But in investigating item response theory, FMCSA says, we've discovered a bunch of opportunities for improvement. And so today, gentlemen, I'm hoping to focus this conversation on those opportunities for improvement, on those proposed changes. We can talk about what they are, why they are, how they might impact the industry, what to expect in the future. So with that, I'm going to stop listening to my own voice. I'm going to I'm going to pass it over to Steve Keppler to listen to his sweet voice. Tell us a little bit more about what FMCSA is proposing.
Well, thanks, Sean. I don't know if I have a sweet voice, but certainly I'll try my best. So picking up on that, I think so the approach FMCSA took with the changes was really guided by a couple of different key factors. One, they wanted to make the safety data easier to understand. Two, they wanted to sharpen the focus on higher risk carriers. Three, they wanted to streamline analysis and reporting. Four, really wanted to refine and strengthen safety percentiles. And five, wanted to acknowledge and reinforce safe practices. And some of this picks up, Sean, to your point, on some of the deficiencies that have been pointed out over the years. So really that was the kind of their overarching strategy. So as we're going through this, keep that in mind as the listeners. So I think first thing, as Sean mentioned, they put out their proposal on Valentine's Day. There is a comment period, 90-day comment period. So the first major change that they proposed is changes to the basics. All right. So they're now going to be called safety categories. And so they've reorganized them. They have the drug and alcohol basic essentially is going away. Very small number of violations discovered in that basic. The violations are still going to remain, but they're going to be moved into the unsafe driving basic. They've also kind of bifurcated the vehicle maintenance basic into a vehicle maintenance driver observed and vehicle maintenance. So the driver observed essentially are those violations that a driver can observe during a pre-trip inspection or could be documented during a CVSA level 2 inspection, which is a walk-around inspection. The vehicle maintenance inspection essentially is all the other maintenance violations. The other thing that they did is violations jumping in and out of service order, as an example. Now, regardless of what basic that was in the past, all of those are going to be moved into the unsafe driving basic. So that's from an organization, again, calling them safety categories. And the one thing I'll mention also on the vehicle maintenance basic side is some of the work that they did there was guided by years ago, back in about 2008, 2009, there was a negotiated rulemaking on roadability with the intermodal industry. And so that was to kind of assign violations, right? Or the driver identified versus IEP identified. So that guided some of their thinking there. The next major change is they consolidated violations. So 959 violations, as Sean mentioned, kind of they've escalated over the years. So they've moved them into groups. So they've went from 959 violations to 116 different groups, grouped by safety category. The idea there is for example, if a driver gets a 14-hour violation, 11-hour violation, a 30-minute rest break violation, as an example, now in CSA, those all are accounted individually and have their own severity weights. In the new methodology, that would be one violation. So they're grouping them into that group. They've also identified 14 violations that are operating under an out-of-service order that currently aren't in the SMS that will be added to the unsafe driving basic. And part of the rationale here is from their perspective and the analysis they did, the idea was they determined that whether a safety issue is identified is more influential on risk than determining how many ways it's documented, right? So the mere fact that a violation existed in that group is more important to propensity for crash risk than how many times it was documented. That's an important point. The next thing that they've done is they've simplified the severity weights. As you know, now today they're ranked from 1 to 10, 10 being the most severe. And so they're collapsing that into two categories, basically a violation of 1 or a 2. So all violations are 1s unless that violation group has 1 or more out of service violation in that group, or there's a disqualifying driver violation, and those disqualifying violations as identified in 383.51 would have a 2. The idea there is obviously with out of service conditions and disqualifying drivers, they're more severe. So two severity weightings. The other thing that Sean mentioned, one of the industry challenges, was this whole notion of peer groupings. And so they're moving to a proportionate percentile model. It's somewhat complicated, but essentially it's what they're going to do is they'll take a carrier and they'll rank what they were in category. Say, for example, if they had 11 to 20 violations versus 21 to 50, they will take an average. Okay, if they jump categories, they'll take an average from the higher category versus the lower category, and they'll average those two, essentially taking an average across those two safety event groups. The idea there is it will help to minimize the potential jumps. They did analysis on this and identified that it indeed essentially made some good changes there, and they found that rarely did anyone jump more than 10 percentile groups. So that was a really a good change, we think, to try and get at that issue. The other thing that they did relating to proportionate percentiles is there's only going to be benchmarked once a year, essentially. So at the beginning of the year, whatever category you reside in, you will reside in that category. And so from a carrier's perspective, you're really measuring against yourself versus your peers, and you won't adjust like it is today. So those are two pretty significant changes to try and address that particular problem. Next they addressed kind of segmentation and thresholds. So the driver fitness basic, one of the issues that has been, and if you look at some of the studies, in particular the study by Attree, they found an inverse relationship to crash risk with that basic. So what they've done is they've adjusted the threshold in the driver fitness basic and moved it up to 90th percentile for general. They've adjusted it up at 10 points to passenger and hazmat carriers as well. And they've also created segmentation within that safety category. So now they're segmenting straight carriers, which if you have more than 30% of your total power units, you are now in the straight carrier segment group. And if you have 70% or more of your total power units in your fleet that are combinations, you're going to be a combination carrier. So they've segmented those, and they've found, and partially, and this gets back to the point, Bert, we've chatted about a little bit, kind of how do you address for kind of operational differences? And this is one way they're trying to tackle this. They found that the violations in the straight carrier group are very different in many cases than the combination carrier, particularly when it comes to licensing issues and medical certificate issues. So they're trying to address that in that way. With respect to hazmat, they've elevated the threshold, again, up to the 90th percentile threshold, and they've also segmented that safety category into cargo tank carriers and non-cargo tank carriers. Again, they looked at the violation kind of profile of those two groups, found them to be very different, so they're going to treat them differently in this new segmentation. Last two things, really prioritization. So with respect to data, so if carriers don't have a violation in any of the safety category within the last 12 months, they're not going to have a score, emphasizing more recent data as important. And the last is they've updated the utilization factor. Right now, I won't go through the details, but right now up to 200,000 miles per power unit, they've upped that cap to 250,000. So to round it all out, take all that in kind of crank it through the grinder, if you will. The end result is, under the current methodology, there's about 50,000 carriers that are prioritized. The new methodology is increased 3%, 51,000 carriers prioritized. And the crash rates of those carriers go from 7.08 to 7.77, a 10% increase in crash rate. So that's taking it all into account. That's how it all shakes out in the wash. So that's a quick elevator speech of
yeah, that was a long elevator ride. But hey, we made it to the top, and so that's what matters, right?
And I've got
well, I think the best way to tackle this conversation is I'd like to take each one of those kind of in turn. We don't have to talk in depth about each one, but maybe we can talk about sort of the specific changes first, if that's all right with you guys. I'll just kind of step us through a few of those.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
that's
Bert.
great, Sean. I do want to just throw out to both of y'all. Y'all dug deeper in this and unpacked it far more than I have. But tell me the why, not maybe as we see it with my somewhat jaded thoughts, but tell me why this is better or different, because we continue to see changes and we continue to see new iterations. But does this address, I know, Steve, you went through it kind of quickly, but do you feel that this is going to address most of the issues or concerns that most motor carriers have today with CSA?
I think it's going to address a number of the concerns folks have had. I do. When you look across the gamut, and some of the fleets we've talked to, and it depends from what perspective your lens is, right? So, and where you sit. But a number of the carriers we've talked to so far that have had the chance to look at their previews have seen reductions in their scores.
Which is a great point, by the way, motor carriers listening. I work with them. I'm sure y'all both do also. I've got many clients have not looked at the preview yet, and that's available, correct?
Yes, it is. Yes,
yeah.
It is.
Go look.
Yeah, you can definitely go on now and look, and to follow up on what Steve said. I think I was expecting really some changes around the edges. Some minor adjustments to severity weights or time weights or whatever the case was. And this was, in my opinion, an honest look at the program. And some of the initial feedback that I'm getting is quite good for those carriers that have looked at their profiles. They're seeing those types of improvements. Steve made an interesting point earlier about whether or not we're focusing now on severity or particular violations. We spent a lot of time debating CSA and debating the value of this violation versus the value of this violation. If this driver is speeding at this speed, then it's more dangerous than this speed. Like, boy, I spent hours and hours talking about that over the years. And now FMCSA has kind of tossed that to the curb, and they've said, hey, what matters to me seems to be the frequency with which you violate these rules. What do you guys think about a focus on frequency versus a focus on severity?
Go ahead.
I got to say, real quick. I mean, so when you go through that, I go back to some of the first study I saw. CSA did it really impact crashes on the highway, right? Which is where, from the insurance perspective, we try to live. And I can tell you today, I think of my clients that are getting, no blank logbook over and over and over. And they've gone alert in hours of service. And they're getting drivers who have tried, or maybe they didn't try properly, but they don't have an updated med cert with the state, but they have a current med cert, but it wasn't updated properly with the state, and they're alert in driver fitness. But that carrier has an 8 in crash, right? So there's no direct line to those violations, and that being alert in that basics, there's no direct line drawn to their crash risk. So that's very frustrating. So I'm with you. I guess I'd rather see frequency of severe violations than just frequency of all violations. Is that a fair statement?
I think that, and that's to that point, Bert, and to your question, Sean, I think a couple of things. One, to your point, Bert, about severity, I think with the out of service violations now being a 2 versus a 1, if you look at that kind of today, so use an example, say of a carrier has a violation of a 5, and that's an out of service condition, they get an extra 2 points. So it's an extra 40% weighting on that violation, right? Today. So in the new model, it's 100% extra weighting. So it puts a lot more emphasis on those out of service conditions, right? So to your point, to some degree, they're kind of straddling your point. I think the other thing that I think what's with these changes is they're trying to attack the enforcement disparity question in a different way, because as we know, depending on what day it is and where you are, same truck, same driver, one state could cite certain violations, another could cite another. So one of the concerns industry has had over the years, this goes back to my days at CVSA, was stacking violations, right? So So it minimizes the impact of that in this model too. So it kind of takes that issue doesn't remove it entirely, but it certainly minimizes that impact, oversizing impact on the scores.
So I'm going to say something that maybe doesn't get me any fan mail. Bert, I appreciate the frustrations of carriers that consistently get de minimis violations for things that don't necessarily point directly to crash risk. But others would argue that that indicates a lack of safety management controls if we can't get control over those little things. And that's part of why I like this focus on severity, or rather on frequency, right? Because we got to be able to get a hold of those. Now, to Steve's point, like if I've messed up my day on hours of service and I have an 11-hour and a 14, it's kind of the same violation. Mm-hmm. So we should count that once, and I appreciate that. Now, in order to make up for not getting fan mail, I'm going to say something that might get me some fan mail, and to say, Steve, this idea that what they've done here at all improves regional geographic enforcement disparity, I believe is laughable. In fact, you read the notice, and the notice says, hey, we decided not to address regional or geographic enforcement disparity because we don't want to influence how the states enforce the rules. Now, it took a long time, and you know this, Steve, it took a long time to get enforcement to even acknowledge that CSA was a thing they should think about. So I don't think that addressing it in CSA would impact how states enforce the rules. Like, they're always going to have that sort of disparity. So that, to me, was one of the big disappointments, is that they did an analysis and they looked at, okay, if we accepted item response theory, then we would accommodate geographic enforcement disparity in this super complicated way with beta and theta and all these statistical terms. But they failed to look at any practical solutions to regional geographic enforcement disparities. I mean, we've got data on who writes more when.
Right. Why
can't we sort of accommodate that? You know what I'm saying?
No, I mean, it's a good point, and that's why I said they attempted to. And at the end of the day, CSA shouldn't drive the ship here with enforcement. Enforcement's going to be enforcement, and they have unique situations. And I suspect any type of data model, as soon as you create it, it's going to be outdated to try and address, because things change. So I think, the states, and if you talk to the states, they'll tell you they don't necessarily want their officers understanding how CSA works, because they don't want them playing judge and jury on the roadside. Right. And that's not their job. Their job is to do the inspection and document the violations, period.
And Steve, I'm fully on board with that. And if you've been out there, and I'm sure you have with your time at CBSA, you talk to the officers in the scale houses, you get that feeling, right? They're doing what they do. But I have to, and I guess I'm just saying this, is repeating the obvious. And by the way, Sean, you're off every Christmas card list I know of just from your comment. But you can drive from Georgia to Texas, and I hear this all the time. My driver drove from Georgia to Texas. He didn't get cited here, and here, but he gets to Savannah. He gets 3 handheld device citations and 2 seatbelt citations. And then in Texas, he's getting every lamp written up that he ever looked at. So I'm not agreeing or disagreeing. I just wish there was some accommodation, or maybe that points back to your previous. Maybe that is CBSA's job to try to make that standard across the country.
And CBSA has, I think, give credit to CBSA. Their new out of service criteria is coming out effective April 1, and they've done some really important things, and they've worked on stacking over the years. So I do think they've been doing a good job. I have here in front of me the distillation of SMS violations to new violation severity groups.
Love to see that.
And I think it's pretty interesting and pretty telling, right? So in the new vehicle maintenance basic or safety category, there's 406 possible violations that have been distilled down to just 15 groups. So you can get any number of 406 violations, and it comes down to only 15 groups. The other big basic that happens in is the hazardous material compliance basic goes from 369 to just 14.
Wow.
So I do think that's going to clear up some of what you're talking about, Bert. At least I hope so. But then the basic that hardly changes comparatively, unsafe driving, which is the one I think we'd all agree, looks or has a closer correlation to crash risk, that goes from 59 violations to 32.
I think the only point I'll add there is that I don't think you mentioned on the maintenance is with the new category of driver observed, that has 35 groups in it. So if you compare that versus the maintenance, there's a lot more in the driver observed than there in the vehicle maintenance, which I think, certainly seems to lend itself more emphasis on those driver observed violations potentially impacting on the score. So,
I really wanted to talk about this driver observed because I think it's one of the most interesting things that they've done here, and as we work with carriers and as carriers try to drive down their vehicle maintenance basic, we really always, because we're dealing with the safety folks and the driver, we're really focused on DVIRs. And boy, carriers, drivers, such a challenge doing DVIRs in the best way possible. What do you guys think? I mean, this is going to shine a bright light on the carriers doing a good job with DVIRs and a carrier doing a bad job with DVIRs. Do you think that's going to improve safety? Do you think, what do you guys think of that bifurcation?
Yeah, I agree. I think we're going to see those. I work in the intermodal space, and we all know it's the independent contractor space, and sometimes those drivers get a little lax in their vehicle inspections. I think it will, and it's frequently those trucks do need to be inspected more often, and probably the light does need to be shined on them. I'll say it that way as best I can.
I think
room for improvement in that equipment.
No, I mean, it's a good point, Bert. I think if you dig kind of deep into how kind of as FMCSA kind of thought through this, what the kind of the underlying foundational document says is with this change, although there's a slightly lower crash rate for these prioritized carriers, the new categories would prioritize 18% more carriers in vehicle maintenance under the proposal versus the old. And those carriers are involved in 34% more crashes. So that's a huge difference, right? So
going straight to that, I guess goes back to my previous. So is there consideration in this somewhere where you have a 90 in vehicle maintenance, but your crash score is a 6?
I don't think we can eliminate that possibility hardly ever because crashes are rare and unpredictable events, just generally speaking. So I think that's possible. I appreciate Dr. Keppler's astute mathematical analysis of the vehicle maintenance bifurcation. I think that's because, but I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's because we've now taken one basic into two, and now two have prioritization chunks. So just by its nature, we improve. So this is one of the things that I was really thinking about. You're right on the numbers, the absolute numbers, right? But, and I know you read the same thing I did. The crash rate per 100 power units for the entire grouping goes down for prioritized carriers, right? By a percentage that Steve has probably already calculated in his head and will share with us later. And the same for acute and critical violations. That went down as well. So they're prioritizing more carriers, but on average, those carriers being prioritized are marginally more safe than the ones that were being prioritized before.
Yeah, I mean, it's this, to me, this is one, to your point, this is one of the more interesting parts of what they've suggested here, because if, if you look at this, to your point, crashes are rare events, but if you kind of understand how things operate in the field with crash investigations and things like that, oftentimes police accident reports, don't necessarily paint the full picture of what happened in that crash. Oftentimes, those crashes aren't investigated by a CVSA certified inspector that does an inspection on the truck and understands and reports on the condition of the vehicle, right? So there's been this long-standing debate of how much vehicle maintenance violations contributed to crash involvement, because we really don't have a good handle on that. So to me, this is one of the most interesting parts of this, to see if FMCSA's assessment, right, plays itself out with these reorganizations, and does it really target crash risk the way that they propose that it will.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think one of the other things I'm interested to see how it plays out is the proportional percentile changes, right? Because, and I'm sure Bert and Steve, I'm sure you hear from the same bubble carriers who call and say, hey, I think next month I'm going up over to the next safety event group. What's that going to do to my score? And sometimes the answer is like, buckle up, because this is going to be a rough ride.
I would say if you're the smallest carrier in the biggest peer grouping, yes, it's always bad for you. That's what I've noticed.
Yeah. Undeniably. In almost every category, with the exception of, like, I've seen hazmat do some crazy things. But what the proportional percentile, I think, is aiming to do is understanding the direction, that true direction of the carrier from a compliance measurement standpoint, right? Am I improving month over month? Am I getting worse month over month? And should we be paying attention as a result? There were some comments in the docket, that were concerned about the size of carriers, and how do we get to sort of, and that was one of the longtime complaints of CSA, is that, we're not looking at absolute safety. We're looking at relative safety based on all of these different peer groups. And of course, I don't think we can get to like an absolute safety number as many times as I probably advocated for that and in previous jobs. I don't think that there's a number that we could all agree on that says like, this is safe and this is not. But what proportionate percentile gets to is, where's the direction of my safety program? Where's the direction of my compliance program? Am I getting better or am I getting worse? Or however I did that. And I think that's a positive change for sure.
Yeah, I do too. Coupled with kind of how they're approaching the benchmarking approach, right? So a carrier really can evaluate more, and their changes are really more based upon their own activities and their own control versus what their peers are doing. So I think,
Steve, let me ask you this, because you gave a number earlier, I think you said a 3% increase right now slated for intervention, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So the carriers under the proposed methodology, those that slated for intervention would increase by 3% total.
Does that pool stay the same and increase by 3%, or is that a complete shakeup of who's in that pool?
It's a shift. Each the new safety categories would shift from the proposed basics. Nominally, each category shifts some. The biggest change is in vehicle maintenance.
So you could have been in it and be out of it. You could have been on the edge of it and possibly be in it.
Yeah, and
I've seen it happen both ways.
Yes.
In fact, one of our clients has 3 in alert. They're down to 1 under the proposal.
Okay.
But then, I was cruising through the docket earlier today, and a carrier had none, and then all of a sudden was over in unsafe driving, most likely the result of out of service violations or driver disqualification violations. So I do think that there's going to be a shakeup, and hopefully it's for the better. We work, I think all of our clients, Steve, correct me, that we've talked to have seen improvement.
Yes.
folks honestly working on safety programs and safety improvements, which I think, which for me makes me hopeful of the system, because if these folks that I know that I work with on a regular basis, I know that they're implementing programs for change, and the new measurement system sort of rewards them for that in some way, I think that's generally a good thing. But, I suppose long run we'd have to see.
Yeah, I think the one example that I've heard that's talking about the vehicle maintenance, in one case, one carrier we talked to, their score, when it was bifurcated, their vehicle maintenance score went down significantly, but their driver observed score actually went up. So that, I think that's kind of one of the areas where we're going to see, because that has probably the most violations, as we know it has the most violations, and there's major changes in the groupings. I think that's where we're going to see some potential shifts there.
And the other big shifts I think we're going to see. Sorry, Bert.
No.
The other big shifts I think we're going to see are going to be in hazmat and driver fitness, as they segment those out. And you talked about that, Steve, a little bit. Driver fitness is going to segment. They're going to take out straight trucks. So we'll have straight truck and combo. And then hazmat's going to go from cargo tank to non-cargo tank. And I think that's going to be a big shakeup, truthfully, because now all of your, we know that straight truck fleets tend to have a higher driver fitness basic score because compliance is more challenging when you're not sure, when your types of equipment are varying a lot and a couple pounds could change the classification of the vehicle, when you're required to keep your med card on your person. All of those things make compliance more challenging. So now all these folks are going to be rated against one another. Conversely, just a few violations in the combo category could have a significant impact on carrier scores there.
Yeah, no, you're right. The violation rates of those straight truck operators are about 4 times in the driver fitness, those of the combos. And you're right. I mean, those straight truck, those, as we know, many of the carriers in that group are transportation is an afterthought. They have a business that just happens to operate trucks, right? And so that we have a lot of compliance challenges in that tend to, kind of not saying broad strokes, but there tend to be more compliance challenges in that group.
I want to quickly ask, as we kind of run toward the hour here, guys, just the term I've heard used, and I've read it, disqualifying violations. Today, nothing in a roadside really disqualifies. Is there any implication that in the future a roadside CSA violation is going to disqualify a driver?
Well, I think, and Steve, correct me here, I think what they're referring to, and this refers to the unsafe driving safety category, what they're looking at is stuff that means you've been disqualified, like your CDL has been downgraded or disqualified.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what that's referencing. It's there's a specific defined set of disqualifying violations under 383.51. But to your point, Bert, there are, for example, there's also something called red flag violations.
Yes.
That as you know, and carriers and drivers can be and have been issued notice of claims, fines from roadside inspections that have those violations. So it happens. It happens today. So
I have seen on occasions, why I asked this, I've seen on occasion where a driver gets a 15 over observed or a handheld device observed on a roadside, but there's no citation ever issued. And, I can tell you for a lot of times that goes to completely, the carrier does something about it internally. Of course they have to, they feel like they need to, but there's no disqualifying of that driver within the system.
I looked through the docket. There's about 47 comments so far. I'm sure we're going to see a lot more. But two of the comments hit on just what you said, Bert. One was a carrier who was frustrated that they feel like drivers don't have enough skin in the game. on some of these things, and a lot of that's because they're getting these warnings, not those citations, right? And so drivers that have, carriers that give their drivers or contractors more independence, they don't necessarily feel the sting quite as much. And so I can see that. The other thing, and complaints about those warnings have certainly permeated in the comments as well. So I think those are good and fair points.
I think the other thing that really hasn't been talked about at all, and it's somewhat to that point, Sean, is, and you mentioned it in your opening, is what happens to the adjudications policy, right? So right now, if there's the FMCSA and SMS has a policy, if depending on what happens in court when those violations get adjudicated, there's methods for how they treat that. And if the driver's convicted of a different charge, for example, say it was a 10-point score, if that's the case, that point score goes down to a 1, right? So now, what happens if they have a 1 and it gets? And so is there any relief that can be provided in those cases? And that was a big contentious conversation with industry for a long time to figure out how we're going to do that. So that's another thing I think that, kind of as we kind of peel back these different layers of the onion, we'll find these kind of things of, okay, well, how do we deal with this?
Yeah, I got a violation on roadside. I had it adjudicated, but I had 2 other violations in the same category.
Right.
So what do I data queue them all?
Right.
How much am I going to use data queue? What's going to be a long-term impact? So we'll have to see.
What's the timeline on this? What do y'all think the timeline? When is this rolling out? I know we're in comment period, but are they fast tracking this thing? We're trying to get it out soon.
I'll take a first stab at that here, Steve, and you let me know if you think I'm on or off. I'll give you an over and under, and you guys can bet on the over or under. So I think, first of all, I'm going to point to a couple things. One, they came out of the box with a 90-day comment period. Normally it's like 30 or 60, and then they extend it to 90. This one came out of the box at 90. I feel like they're going to want to really ramp up education. They've got 3 or 4 webinars and Q&A sessions planned for this month. I think they're working very honestly to get all the feedback they can so that they can implement something. I mean, we're unsure what's going to happen in the next election. And I think there's probably some desire to get something done before we all have to sit on our hands for another 4 years. So, keeping in mind, of course, that FMCSA didn't have to issue a notice on this at all. Like, this isn't even a regulatory thing. This is just an enforcement regime, which they can change whenever they want. So I think they also have on the docket that they want to work on the safety fitness procedures. It feels like to me they need to finish CSA before they can really think about that. So I'm going to aggressively put the over-under at MLK Day 2024.
Okay. I a couple thoughts. You took some things from what I was thinking about, but obviously a lot of it is going to depend on what kind of comments they receive, and so I would, when this first came out, that was my thought too, a year. But I wouldn't be surprised, given at least the initial reaction, that their target date is by the end of this calendar year.
Ooh, he takes the under.
I do.
I thought I was being aggressive.
Because it's not a rule, right? They've done, I think, an exhaustive approach to try and address all the comments ahead of time. And so I would not, and partially because they probably want to get it done before we go into 2024, because significant things don't really happen in election years. So that's my thought.
Except for elections.
True.
Those are
That's true. Right. Yes.
Good. Well, that's a good.
If I had to guess, I'm thinking well past both of y'all. So that's just my, again, jaded thoughts on everything I see come out of the FMCSA.
He's got no faith.
I have zero faith. Crash preventability guidelines still staying the same? Absolutely. So have the ability to adapt.
I don't think those are changing.
Okay.
Yeah. Hopefully they get more staff. That's the only thing that can happen there is they get more staff and things actually happen quicker.
Right.
Will this ever go public again? Will the data ever go public again?
Ooh, boy. Go ahead, Steve. I'll let you tackle that.
I think the way that they've positioned this and the way they've announced it, they have absolutely in their mind, they're going to try and make this go public again. So, I think they're going to try. We'll have to wait and see. They're probably going to get sued regardless of what they do. But
Yes.
the interesting thing about that though is, if I'm FMCSA, I'm going to evaluate this ongoing, and it almost, they may want to kind of have IRT running in the background, right? And so they can continue to move forward with CSA in this manner, but run the IRT model in the background. Just don't, obviously don't make that public, just to see how things match up and so because I think at some point if they do continue to get challenged and they have to pull something off the public radar, they may rethink how they do things in the future, right? If they don't have to show anything to the public, well, okay, that's fine. We're gonna change the model the way we want to change it. So I don't know. But it's a very interesting.
That's an interesting idea right there, Steve, for sure. From the public perspective, I think I'm generally there with you, Steve. I thought about that question a little bit before this podcast, and two things came to mind that I maybe hadn't thought too much about before. Number one, the National Academies of Sciences was asked to answer that question by Congress, right? And what they said was, FMCSA, you need to study the accuracy of your percentile scores and its statistical relationship to crash risk, period. And FMCSA, in response to the National Academies, said, okay, we'll do that after we've decided what to do on IRT. So it seems like they have some studying to do first. I do think that historically they've wanted to make it public. They feel like the shame game is a helpful safety strategy. However, if we're sitting here, Bert, you're in insurance, we're consultants in safety and compliance. Like, I got to tell you, the toothpaste is out of the tube.
Yes.
People know that these scores exist and they know where to find them and how to get them. The only people that don't are like the press.
Yes.
Right? So,
or the carriers,
benefit. I mean, there's some benefit, but
yeah.
I don't know.
And to that point, real quick on that, I'll get this 1,000 times as I did with IRT, and I'm sure you did also. Whatever the score is, guys, motor carriers, truck drivers, whoever's listening, the higher, the worse for an underwriter. That's as simple as it gets. You can make it 90, you can make it 200. You're gonna get graded, and the higher that score, that underwriter is going to look at that as a riskier motor carrier. Now, we do a lot of things to mitigate that, but I don't care what the grading says. You can grade it on an abacus. It doesn't matter. The higher the score, the underwriter is going to look at you as a more risky carrier.
I really like that idea, Bert, about the abacus, because it's probably the best way to rate carriers. But the point is not lost. Like, hey, if you're listening to this podcast, you're going to need to deal with your CSA score, no matter how it's calculated and what it is.
Yes. So
take this time to go to www.regulations.gov. The docket number ID is FMCSA-2022-0066. Get in there, read that notice, review your score, submit a comment because it's not going away. and we're going to have to deal with it. So we got to come together and put our comments in. Like I said, 47 people have already done that. One of them, I'm not going to count as a comment because it was really like a data queue complaint. They were talking about a specific instance where they were unfairly ticketed for X, Y, or Z. So that was really just a data queue. But there are 46 other comments that are germane to the system.
And comments matter. That's what I would also say. Comments matter,
Yes.
everyone.
Amen.
No doubt about that. Absolutely. So get involved in the process. They FMCSA has listened. I think they're trying their best, and they want that feedback. They, like Sean mentioned earlier, they didn't have to put this out for comment, but they did.
And I know one of y'all ribbed me about lost my faith, but it has restored my hope that they are listening. I think they're trying to bridge that gap and be a more equal playing field for our motor carriers out there. So anyway.
Yep. Agreed.
Great.
Well, took a little longer on this podcast, but I think it's a big issue and it's an important one. I hope anybody out there listening who's interested reaches out and lets us know what they're thinking. Steve, I'll pass it over to you to send us home. But Bert, thanks for your wisdom and your experience as always. Steve, I appreciate you and your perspective, and I'm just encouraging everybody to stay active.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I think get involved, review your scores, comment, make your voices heard and make your voices known wide and loud. They're listening. Thanks for listening to this episode of True North Truck Thought. If you enjoyed the topic today and want to tune in for future conversations here on the Triple T Pod, make sure to follow us. Also, please don't hesitate to let us know which topics you want us to cover in future episodes. Drop us a line in the comment section or send us an email to transportationnews@TrueNorthCompanies.com.